Hey guys, so today I'm here with the Teraflex 2.5-inch ST2 suspension lift kit with 2.1 Falcon monotube shocks, fitting all 2007 to 2018 two-door JK Wranglers. So when you're upgrading your suspension and adding a lift to your Wrangler, it can add a number of different benefits, including trail performance, street comfortability, and street ride quality, as well as just overall aesthetics to your Wrangler. So this option by Teraflex is going to be for that Wrangler owner who's looking to do all of that. This is going to be named the ST, which means street and trail. So this is going to be perfectly tuned for that street ride and that ride quality, as well as the trail performance that you're getting out of this lift kit. So not only are you getting a perfect split between trail and street performance, you're also getting that mild 2.5 inches of lift, which is going to open up a lot of room in the wheel well for larger wheels and tires, better articulation off-road. But what it's also going to do is level out the rake in the hood and overall create a more aggressive stance with your Wrangler. Now, like I said, this is going to be a high quality lift kit, so this is perfect for somebody who's looking for an all-inclusive lift kit that comes with everything that you need in order to install this on your Wrangler. So you are getting a lot of high quality components with this. You are getting the 2.1 Falcon monotube shocks, which is going to be a higher performance shock. So this is perfect for somebody who's spending a lot of time on the trail, but also wants something that's going to ride good and have some good ride quality on the street. Now, what I do really like about this is that it comes with everything that you need to accommodate for that extra 2.5 inches of lift that you're putting on your Wrangler. So you're getting front lower control arms, you are getting an adjustable track bar, which a lot of lift kits don't come with, and you're getting all of the brackets to extend your brake lines and even the track bar in the back. So like I said, this is a very inclusive lift kit, perfect for somebody who's looking to invest in their suspension and also wants to kind of get it done in one shot. So as far as wheel and tires go, you are going to add 2.5 inches to your suspension, so you are going to be able to fit comfortably a 35-inch tire. So a 35-inch tire is going to fill out the wheel well really nicely. It's still going to leave you a lot of room for articulation on the trail, which is something that you want. You want a lot of up travel on the trail, and a 35-inch tire is definitely going to allow it. Now, as for 33s, they may look a little bit smaller, but they may fit just right if you are looking for a smaller tire that allows you a lot more up travel than a 35-inch tire would. And then as for 37s, you may be able to fit them on. You may be able to turn the wheel from lock to lock without any rubbing if you have an aftermarket front bumper. However, these bump stops on this lift kit or paired with this lift kit are not going to accommodate that extra 2 inches in diameter for a 37-inch tire. So if you do hit a bump, you may have tire to fender contact. So overall, in my opinion, a 35-inch tire is going to work perfectly for this lift kit, and it's going to fit very well paired with this lift kit. But like I said, it's going to include everything that you need in order to lift your Wrangler, accommodate for all of that extra height, while also adding a lot of performance and a lot of quality parts into the mix of this lift kit. So when you're taking a look at lift kits all across the board, usually the price will go up or down depending on what's included in the lift kits. So this one is going to be a higher priced option because it really comes with everything that you need. It's going to come with high performance shocks, front lower control arms, it does have a front adjustable track bar, and all of the odds and ends in order to accommodate for that extra 2.5 inches. Now when you're looking at lower priced options, you're either going to be taking a look at options that aren't going to give you a full 2.5 inches. They may not come with all the components that you see in this kit. And then on the other hand, when you take a look at more expensive lift kits, they are usually going to come with more high performance components. You may see piggyback shocks or reservoir shocks, or you may just see more components included in the lift kit. So in my personal opinion, I think this is a perfect option for somebody who's looking to really invest in their suspension system with a high quality kit that's also going to give them a perfect split between trail and street performance. So install is going to be a 3 out of 3 wrenches on the difficulty meter. It is going to be quite hard to get this on, and it'll probably take you about a day to get the job done if you're doing this in your driveway. Now, this is going to take a number of different basic hand tools and also a couple of different specialty tools, but I'll walk you through the install. So speaking of that, let's jump into that now. Tools that I used for my install were a hammer, a small and a large dead blow, a trim removal tool, an air hammer, a pair of safety glasses, an electric impact, a 3/8 inch drive and 1/2 inch drive pneumatic impact, a drill, a tape measure, a large and a small pry bar, a cutoff wheel, a large and a medium pair of channel locks, a pair of vice grips, a pair of snips. You're going to need a standard and metric set of open-ended or box wrenches, as well as ratcheting wrenches, flathead screwdriver, center punch, the provided tool by Teraflex, a Phillips head screwdriver, blue Loctite, a set of different size extensions, a set of Allen sockets or Allen keys, a set of standard and metric deep sockets, shallow sockets, as well as impact sockets, a set of metric swivel sockets, a step bit, a 1/4 inch drive, 3/8 inch drive, and 1/2 inch drive ratchet. So the first step to this install is getting the Jeep up in the air and taking the tires off. Now we are going to be starting in the front, so if you are on the ground with a jack and jack stand, you're going to want to take off those front wheels and tires and chock the rear wheels and tires. Next step is to support our axle. Now we are up on a lift, so I'm going to use pole jacks, but if you are on the ground, you want to make sure that you are supporting the axle with jack stands or whatever you have. So I'm going to be using an 18mm socket and wrench to take off that first sway bar end link. So for the passenger sway bar end link, I am going to be using a swivel socket just because there's not a lot of room over here. It's still going to be an 18mm, and I'm going to use the same 18mm wrench. So what we can do now is fully remove our sway bar end link using a 19mm open-ended wrench to keep this stud still, and that same 18mm socket to take off that nut. So what we can do now is disconnect the axle side of our track bar. Now we are going to be replacing our track bar, so we are going to do the frame side as well. So for the axle side, I'm going to be using a 21mm socket. So the frame side of our track bar does not have a flag nut on the other side, so I'm going to use a 13/16 inch box wrench to hold that still while we use our 21mm socket to take that bolt out. And after that, we can fully remove our track bar. So what we can do next is remove the lower shock bolt. I'm going to be using an 18mm swivel and an 18mm wrench to take that bolt out. Now you may have to tinker with the axle height in order to free up that bolt. Put a little bit of compression on the shock and it should slide right out. So our next step is to fully remove our shock. There is going to be a stud going through the shock perch here. There is going to be a nut on the other side that we will have to crack free. So I'm going to use a 16mm wrench, an open-ended wrench to keep the shock body still. There is a captured nut here on the shock body, and then a 16mm ratcheting wrench for that top nut. Now I would recommend soaking this in a penetrating catalyst like PB Blaster or WD-40. These can get very rusty and are susceptible to breaking. So just make sure that you soak it before. Then we can take off that nut and fully remove our shock. So after that nut is removed, what we can do is wiggle out our shock, making sure to get the cup washer and the bushing from the top of our shock perch. So after our shock is out, what we can do since we're on this side is take our brake line bracket off of our frame and then off of our spring perch. So I'm gonna grab a trim removal tool to remove our breather hose from that bracket, just so we can give it some extra slack. We wanna make sure that the brake line's not stressed out once we drop our axle. So we can take a 10mm socket and take off this bolt and just unhook that from our frame. So that's just going to give us a little bit of extra slack, and then we can move down to our spring perch and remove that bracket as well. So our next step is to totally discard this bracket. Now what I'm going to do is make a notch in the bracket with my cutoff wheel and then pry it back. Teraflex recommends that you just pry it back without making a notch. Now that is incredibly hard to do because of the structural integrity of this actual bracket. So making a notch in it makes it a little bit easier. Now, if you are going to do this step, make sure you keep the soft line in mind. You cannot nick the soft line or else you'll have to replace it. So just be very careful. We're not gonna go all the way through. We are just going to make a little notch on here and lessen the structural integrity of it. But first step, we need to get our ABS line out of the way. So I'm gonna take a trim removal tool and take these 2 clips out of the bracket. Now also, if you notice, I'm keeping this bracket in place up against our shock mount with a pair of vice grips. This is just gonna make sure that it's not moving around and make sure our cutting is precise. So I'm just gonna pop this line out of our soft line here, move that out of the way. Then we can grab a pair of safety glasses and a cutoff wheel and make a notch in this bracket. So after we have made a notch, what I'm gonna do is grab a pair of channel locks and try to pry this open. Now the actual bracket is gonna wanna move, but it will max out at some point. So you should be able to wiggle out the brake line once you've pried it back a little. I did put a little bit of PB Blaster in there just to kind of lube it up to get it out of there. So after you have pried this completely back and open it up where you can squeeze your soft line out, I put a little bit of lubricant in there so we could slide it out, but just wiggle out your soft line and completely discard this bracket. So what we can do now is just repeat that process on the other side. So this is actually how it should pry back once you make a notch in the metal, but once that's out, we can just take this off. And what we can do now is lower our axle and take out our springs. So our next step is to remove our stock bump stop because we will be replacing these with longer bump stops. I did spray a little bit of PB Blaster on there just to kind of make it a little bit easier to take out the bump stop since they can be difficult. And I also have a flathead screwdriver because there are little tabs on the jounce tube, so that is going to lock this in place. It makes it a little bit difficult to take out. So I'm going to try to pry this out and wiggle it out. So our next step is going to be to remove our control arms. So these are going to be the lower front control arms. I'm going to be using a 21mm socket on the bolt head side and a 13/16 inch wrench on the nut side. Then we can remove the top part of the mount. Now, be mindful, as soon as you loosen this up, the control arm is gonna swing down. I just have it resting on my shoulder here, but we're gonna use that same 21mm socket and 13/16 inch wrench. So now that we have our factory system out of our Wrangler, I wanted to sit it next to our Teraflex suspension system and show you guys a little bit of a comparison and what big upgrades that you're going to get with your new Teraflex system. So right off the bat, you can tell that this is overall a big upgrade in performance just looking at the suspension system sitting on the table, but it's also going to do a really good job at some restoration and replacing some worn out parts. As you can tell, we have a bunch of rust buildup on all of our components that we pulled out of our Wrangler already, so this is going to do a great job at replacing a lot of those parts. Now, starting off with one of the main components that's going to give you a lot of that ride quality and ride feel out of your Wrangler when you're driving is going to be your shock. So there's really two big schools of thought when it comes to shocks. You're going to have a hydraulic shock and you're going to have a gas charge shock. So a hydraulic shock is very similar to the factory. That's what your factory shock is going to be. That's going to give you a very fluid and very comfortable ride, perfect for the daily driver, but not really good for performance. So once you start to really hit some harder trails and work the shock really hard, it is susceptible to shock fade over time, which is cavitation or foaming forming inside the shock, which leads to shock fade. So a gas charge shock is going to be a more high performance shock, and that's exactly what this Falcon 2.1 monotube shock is going to be. So that's going to separate the oil and gas. It's going to reduce shock fade over time, making it very durable in the inside of the shock, and it's going to give you some high performance, and that's going to be a big upgrade over your factory hydraulic shocks. Now, these are also going to be very durable on the outside as well, and they are going to be made of a 6061 T6 precipitation hardened aluminum alloy shock body, and they're also going to have a 3/4 inch chrome plated shaft. So that's going to prevent any buckling. It is going to do a great job on the trail if it does take a hit off-road. So what I do really like about these shocks is the fact that they are corner specific and they are perfectly tuned for street and trail driving. So it is going to be very comfortable even though it is a high performance shock that might feel a little bit stiffer. So moving down the line, another big key component in this lift kit is going to be your springs. That's what's going to give you your height out of this lift kit. So these are going to be 2.5 inches taller than your factory springs and are going to act as a really good replacement to something that is worn down and rusty like ours that just came out of our Wrangler. So another big component of this lift kit, and what I do really like about this lift kit, is that it includes the front lower control arms. So when you lift your Wrangler, you're throwing off a lot of angles. Your axle is actually going to roll, so your front lower control arms play a big key of rolling that axle back, and that's exactly what Teraflex is going to include. So they include pre-adjusted and pre-tuned front lower control arms, which will even out the playing field for that geometry that we threw off in the beginning. So I do really like that those are included, and they're going to be a lot stronger than your factory front lower control arms. Now, with all of those big key components out of the way, there are a bunch of little components that play a key role in accommodating for all of that extra height. So you're getting longer bump stops, which will prevent any fender to tire contact. And you're also getting longer sway bar end lengths. But what I do really like about the ones that Teraflex included is the fact that they do come with quick disconnect hardware. So if you're at the trailhead and you need to disconnect your sway bar end lengths for immediate articulation, all you have to do is pull a pin and slide it off and store it away. And it's just as simple as that. You don't have to manually get under your Wrangler and do it. So that is a big upgrade from our factory sway bar end lengths that, as you can tell, are worn out already. So enough about all of our major key components on the table right here. Let's go ahead and start our install with our new Teraflex suspension system. So now we can go ahead and install our control arm using our factory bolts. We're going to start up at the top, and we're not going to tighten these down. We need to make sure that we get these installed and tighten them back down on their own weight when the Jeep's on the ground. So we're going to attach the bolt, attach the nut, and then we can move down to the back there. So now we can attach the bottom of our lower front control arm. I am gonna have somebody again pry on this with a large pry bar just to move the axle forward so we can attach our bolt. So after both of those control arms are in, what we can do next is install our bump stops. So our next step is to install our bump stops. As you can tell, there are a couple blocks of wood here, and that's going to help us press this in. So this little collar on here is going to be tapered. You want to make sure that the bigger end is at the back And at the smaller end, there is going to be a little notch in the plastic there, and that's going to be facing the front of the Jeep. So what I'm going to do is position that in the jounce tube and then just raise up our axle, and it'll basically just press itself in. And then making sure that this is as straight as possible, we can just press that in. You'll see it go in and set into place. So after our first attempt, I put a little bit of grease on there to help work its way into the jounce tube. Hopefully that will press in a little bit easier, and it looks like it is already. There we go. It'll settle right into place. You'll hear it set, and then we can just do the same thing on the other side. So our next step is to install our bump stop extension right here. However, we do have to drill a hole in order to attach this. So we're going to line this up in the center of the spring perch. I'm going to take a center punch and make a mark. And we can discard this for right now. We'll come back to it. So we will have to drill a hole in order to attach our bump stop extension. I'm going to be using a step bit in order to drill a 3/8 inch hole. However, if you don't have a step bit, you will need a smaller drill bit as a pilot hole and then a 3/8 inch drill bit. So right where we hit the spring perch with our center punch, we can go ahead and drill a 3/8 inch hole. So we can put our bump stop extension on top and grab our hardware and secure this down. So now we can secure down our bump stop with our provided hardware. This is going to be the Allen head bolt and the flange nut. You're also going to have a tool to help you reach underneath the spring perch to secure that down. Then you can go ahead and tighten that up with a 7/32 inch Allen key. After that's tight, we can do the same thing on the other side. So our next step is to install our springs. However, on the driver's side, our axle isn't dropping far enough down to fit a spring in that's taller with our new extended bump stop and our bump stop extension. So what I'm going to do is actually disconnect our drive shaft to drop our driver's side axle down a little bit. So I'm going to use a 15mm swivel socket and remove the 4 bolts that are holding the drive shaft flange. I also did make a mark on the flange on the axle as well as the drive shaft just to make sure it's positioned in the correct way when we install it. So I did have to switch to a 15mm 1/2 inch with a 5-inch 1/2 inch extension just because my 3/8 inch impact gun didn't have enough power to take off these bolts. Now that our axle's low enough, what we can do is install our new springs, making sure that they are set in the upper isolator and the pigtail is at the back of our driver's side spring perch. All right, so the axle is gonna roll back and it's kind of gonna be offset. So once you actually raise the axle back up, it will set the spring in place. You just wanna be mindful of that back pigtail, that it's set in the back of the spring perch here. All right, so that's gonna be it for the driver's side, then we can head over to the passenger side. So now we can do the passenger side. I always put the spring underneath the drag link. It gives me a better angle. And I can just wiggle it on into place. So So the pigtail of the passenger side spring will sit at the front of the spring perch, and then on the other side, on the driver's side, it's going to sit in the back. So just make sure that that's seated in the front, and then we can raise up our axle so we can get ready to put in our new shocks. So now we can install our shock. Now there is going to be a tab that's going to go in this hole on the shock perch here, and there is going to be a little notch on there that is going to set itself on top of our shock body. You're also going to get the other side of the cup washer and the bushing, so make sure you have that in hand. What we can do is go behind our brake lines here. Probably a little bit easier to set the tab in this, go up through. So I have the bottom of the shock sitting in the bottom shock mount for a little bit of support. Now I would recommend to lower this down just because there's not going to be a lot of room up here, and we need to squeeze this bushing and cup washer up on top of that stud. So you're going to have to go behind the inner fender liner. You may have to move this around in order to squeeze that in there and make sure that it's sitting correctly on top of the stud. Everything's seated correctly. And then we can take our nylon lock nut and thread that onto the top stud. So once that's threaded onto the top of the shock stud, what we can do is take a 19mm wrench and tighten that down. Now we don't need to technically hold the shock body still. It is going to have a little wiggle room, but that tab is just going to keep it in place. So before we go ahead and mount up the bottom of our shock, we do have to set our anchor for our brake line. So I'm going to take a pair of snips, and on the ABS line, I'm just going to cut off these 2 clips. Be mindful of the ABS line when you're doing this. So once that's gone, we can take the factory bolt, put that through the lower shock mount, hook on our anchor, making sure that it's sticking up. Then we can thread on our nut. We'll tighten this down after we secure down our brake lines. We're just going to put that in place for now. Then we're going to take our ABS line, and we're going to wedge that down to the bottom of our anchor. And we'll take our soft line, put that at the top. So once those are both set in the anchor, we can take the 3 zip ties provided by Teraflex, put them in the 3 channels, 2 on the outside, 1 in the middle, and tighten those down. After those are tightened down to the anchor, what we can do is take that same pair of snips and just trim them up. All right, now we can tighten down our bolt using our 18mm socket and wrench. All right, now we can repeat that same process on the other side. So since the driver's side is a little bit easier to access, since there's not a battery box over here, I'm going to use a 19mm ratcheting wrench. So our next step is to install our sway bar end links. Now we are going to start up at the top. I'm going to place a stud in our sway bar, grab our washer and our nylon lock nut. So after that lock nut is threaded on, what I'm going to do is use a 6mm Allen socket and a 19mm wrench, and we're going to tighten down this nylon lock nut onto our stud on our sway bar end link. All right, so we can do the same thing on the other side, and then we can go ahead and attach the bottom once both sway bar end links are on our sway bar. So now we can attach our pin at the bottom of our sway bar end link mount. Now if you're not going to attach the quick disconnect hardware, you will have to press a metal sleeve into the bottom of your sway bar end link and then bolt it up as normal with the factory hardware, but we're attaching the sway bar end link quick disconnect hardware. So I'm going to put that pin on there, grab our washer as well as our nylon lock nut just like we had on the stud, and we're going gonna thread that into place. Now, in order to tighten this down, you will need a screwdriver. I recommend a Phillips head screwdriver. We're gonna have to stick it through the hole in the pin and then grab a 19mm socket and a ratchet, and then we can go ahead and tighten that down. So when it is getting to the point where it's going to be completely tightened down, you want to make sure that this pinhole is accessible. So once you are ready to install your sway bar end link, it's very easy to put on that pin. So usually just like this is fine. And then we can do the same thing on the other side. But what is basically going to happen is when we pull this down, we'll be able to slip this heim joint over our. So we're going to do the same thing that we just did on the passenger side over on the driver's side. Making sure that our pins are facing in. So what we can do now is attach our sway bar end link to our pin. So I'm going to pull down on the sway bar. I did put a thin layer of grease on here just to help the sway bar and link slip on. So once the sway bar link is on, what we can do is put on our large washer and then take our pin and attach it down. Now once you press the pin on, it should sit over the other pin that's attached to our mount here. And once you're on the trail and want to disconnect your sway bar, all you have to do is pull that pin and store them on what we're going to do next. So let's do the other side and then head to our next step. So before we go ahead and install our storage mount, what we're going to do is put it together. So we have a pin with 4 holes, and this is where we can store our sway bar end links once they are taken off of the axle mounts. So this just threads into that bracket. And then what we can do is put the nut on the other side. This is going to be that low profile nut. Then we can take the screwdriver that we were using before, stick that through, and a 14mm wrench. And we can just snug that up before we go ahead and attach it to our body mount. So now we can head over to the Jeep and attach that to our body mount. So the front body mount is where we're going to be attaching our storage bracket. So I'm going to be using an 18mm socket and an extension to clear our sway bar here, and we're going to remove that nut on the bottom of that body mount. So what we can do next is take our mount, sandwich that in between our bracket and our nut here, thread the nut back on, and then we can tighten that down with the same 18mm socket and extension. So the last thing that we have to do with our sway bar end links is just attach our Zerk fitting. You're going to get a small Zerk fitting for each of your sway bar end links, and we're going to insert that at the bottom, thread that in, and then we can just tighten that down with an 8mm wrench. And then once that's tightened into the sway bar end link, you have to grease these in order to keep them operable for a long time. So then we're just going to do the same thing on the other side. So our last big step in the front is to install our new adjustable track bar by Teraflex. Now, this is going to be a huge upgrade from your factory track bar. As you can tell, it is a lot beefier. It's going to be 230% stronger than the factory track bar, so you can rely on this while you're on the trail to hold up on the trail and be able to take a hit if it needs to. So when you lift your Wrangler, essentially what you're doing is shortening the track bar length. So it's going to throw off the axle and where it's positioned underneath your Wranglers. So you want to make sure that it's centered underneath your Wrangler, and that's exactly what the track bar is responsible for doing. So because this is adjustable, this is going to allow us to make sure that our axle is centered underneath our Wrangler, and what we're going to do is measure that out from eye to eye. 33 inches is a great starting point for measuring out an adjustable track bar for any lift. And then after that, we can go ahead and measure each side from the chassis to the tire and make sure that it's even, making sure that our axle is centered underneath our Jeep. So I have a tape measure here. We're gonna go ahead and measure out what it is already, and then we can loosen up this collar. It's a adjustable collar, just like on your steering linkage, and we can make sure that it's our correct length for our starting point. So you want to make sure that you're measuring the track bar eye to eye, and right now it looks like we're at about 32 inches. So we're going to loosen up this collar. I'm going to be using a 15mm socket in my impact wrench. All right, so you can actually feel once you loosen up that collar. Looks like it's at 33, so what we can do is readjust these collars and tighten those down, and then we can go ahead and install this on a Wrangler. So what we can do now is install our track bar. I did loosen up the clamp that's closest to our frame bracket, just so we can move this back and forth and orient it in the correct way in our bracket. Now, that's not going to really mess with our length at all, but you want to make sure you have the factory bolt in hand. We can line this up, put the factory bolt through. Once it's through, what we can do is thread the nut on the back. And because this is a standard bushing, it's not a Heim joint, we do want to tighten it down while it's on the ground. We don't want to tear the bushing. We're gonna snug that up. So also with keeping this clamp a little bit loose, it's going to help us put it in the frame side bracket, but what it's also gonna do is help us orient this in the correct way where we can adjust it in the future. So I made sure that the bolt side is facing up so we can squeeze an impact wrench in there, and then these are accessible down at the bottom for a wrench if they do start spinning. So what I'm gonna do is just snug these up real quick with an 18mm wrench and 15mm socket. Same thing for the other clamp. And then we'll be able to measure later and tell if we need to adjust this, but for right now, we can move to the back. So after we've connected our track bar, we do have to fully connect it to the axle side once the Jeep is on the ground. So what we can do now is head to the back and support our axle, and we're gonna start by removing our rear shock. So I have an 18mm socket and wrench, and we can start with that lower shock bolt. So once we remove that lower bolt, we're gonna head up to the two upper bolts on our bar pin. So I'm using a 16mm swivel socket and a 15-inch extension, as well as my impact to remove those. And make sure on the second bolt that you be mindful the shock will be fully disconnected. So just be mindful that it doesn't fall on you. So now we can go ahead and disconnect the bottom bolt on our sway bar using an 18mm socket and wrench. So after the lower bolt is taken out, we can move up to the top stud. It's going to be the same thing as the front, so we're going to use a 19mm wrench to hold the stud still. And then we can take an 18mm socket and take that nut off of the stud here. Now what we can do next is disconnect the axle side of our track bar using a 21mm socket. So now we can focus on our brake line brackets. First, we're going to take off the bracket that's holding our e-brake cables. So I'm going to be using a 10mm deep socket in my impact wrench to take off the two nuts that are on the body mounted studs. So after you've disconnected the bracket, what we have to do is take our e-brake lines out of the bracket. So you're just going to have to loop them out. So now we can disconnect our soft line brake line bracket from our frame here with a 10mm socket. So now with the trim removal tool, we can take our ABS line and disconnect that from the frame just so it has a little bit of extra slack when we drop the axle. I'm also going to pull one of the pins from the axle. So now we're gonna go ahead and lower our axle down. The one last thing that I wanna do is just pull this breather hose off of the axle so we're not stressing it out. We can just let it hang there, and then we can lower down our axle so we can get our springs out. So our last thing to take off is our factory bump stops. So we're gonna do the same thing that we did in the front. I sprayed them with a little bit of PV Blaster to help them come out, but I'm also gonna take a flathead screwdriver and try to wedge in to that tab and kind of pry them out at the same time. So our next step is to install our bump stop cups. Now it is going to be tapered, and you want to make sure that where it's labeled front is facing the front of our Wrangler. Now there's going to be a little lip on the inside of here, and this has to go around our bump stop cup on our frame. So what I'm going to do is take a couple blocks of wood and press this in because it will take a little bit of pressure. So I have a bunch of blocks of wood here, and then I'm just going to raise up the axle and it should press onto the factory bump stop cup. So after we have our bump stop cup in place, what we need to do is press in our bump stop. So we're going to do the same thing. I put a little bit of grease on the edge of our bump stop, and we're just going to raise up our axle and press it into place. And I have a couple of blocks of wood here. So once you hear it click into place, we can just do the same thing on the other side. So our next step is to install our bump stop pad. Now, because we have changed the position and size of our bump stop, it will need a little bit of extra space. So making sure that that part with the extra space, the offset side, is facing the front of the Jeep, we can line this up on our factory bump stop pad and install this through the factory holes with our provided hardware. So I have our Allen head bolt and our nylon lock nut. We can thread that on, and we can do the same thing for the back here as well. So what we can do now is take a 1/2-inch wrench, put that on the nut side, and then take a 3/16 inch Allen key. I'm going to use an Allen socket and tighten down that bolt. You can do the same thing for the back. So our next step with our factory isolator is to install our spring. So once you have the spring into place over the spring perch, what you want to do is just raise up the axle to make sure that the spring is stationary. So once both springs are in, what we can do is just raise up the axle a little bit, make sure that they're sitting in place. So then after our springs are in and compressed a little bit, what we can do is add our spring retainer clips. So we have an upper and lower spring retainer. We're gonna start with the lower one. So this is just gonna be a large flat washer. We're gonna put that over the spring perch. We are provided with a bolt, so we're gonna put that through. So once we have the bolt through on the spring perch, you are provided a tool and a flange nut as well as a lock washer. And we're gonna go behind the axle since we don't have a lot of room to get underneath in the front, and we'll secure that on the back of this bolt here. So now that that's threaded into the nut on the other side, we can tighten up that bolt with a 9/16 inch socket. And we can do the same thing on the other side. So a little trick for this, I put a little bit of super glue on here just to make sure that these would stay, just because you are gonna have to put it at a pretty hard angle to get it underneath here. That's your hack for the day. So what we're gonna do now is install our upper retainer clip. So this is gonna go on the top of our coil. You have a flat washer and then also a bolt, and then you're gonna have a self-locking nut. So what we're gonna do is there is gonna be a factory hole on the frame side of the coil bucket up here. So what we're gonna do is stick that bolt through that, go on top of the coil bucket, and secure that down with that nut. Now it is gonna be difficult to see as well as difficult to reach. So once we get that threaded in, what we can do is tighten it down. Now you're gonna need a 19mm socket and a 19mm wrench. So our next step is to install our rear track bar relocation bracket, but it does attach to our lower control arm bolt. So what we're gonna do is take out the driver's side control arm bolt on the axle side using a 3/16 inch box wrench and a 21mm socket. So next we can take our rear track bar relocation bracket with the long bent tab on the side where we just took out that control arm bolt. We can slide this over the factory mounting bracket. So after we've attached our bracket down on our control arm, what we can do next is take our provided sleeve, put that into the factory mount, line that up with either side, take our new provided bolt with our provided flat washer, put that through to the other side, take our provided flat washer and crush nut, and put that on the other side. We can thread that on and tighten that down in just a second. So now we can take our U-bolt, hook that around the back of our axle here, put that through the holes in the bracket, take our flat washers, attach those on, and then take our provided nuts for the U-bolt, and then thread those on as well. Now the last thing that we're gonna do before we tighten anything down is just attach our track bar. Now this should line up with the top hole. However, if you can't get it lined up with the top hole here, then we can go ahead and put it on the ground and then wiggle the back end of the Jeep and get that bolt in. Then we can take our factory bolt and our flag nut, and we'll be able to tighten that down. So now we can tighten down the bolt on our factory location with a 19mm wrench and socket. And then we can also tighten down the U-bolt. Now we want to make sure that we tighten down the actual track bar and the control arm mount while the Jeep is on the ground on its own weight to make sure that we're not tearing the bushing. So now we can tighten down our U-bolt with the same 19mm deep socket. So what we can do now is attach our brake line drop bracket. Now this is not going to be side specific. There's a notch on either side for our factory hard line. So this top tab is going to attach onto the frame with our factory bolt in the factory location. We're gonna thread that into place. Then you might have to bend the hard line. Just be careful when you do this. And that will make it sit in that bracket and line up that hole there. Then we can take the provided hardware. It's gonna be 2 flat washers, a bolt, and a nylon lock nut. We can send that through our factory brake line bracket, through our drop bracket, and then we can tighten that down. So we can tighten that down with an 11mm socket and wrench. And last but not least, we can tighten up our top bolt with a 10mm socket. So what we can do now is attach our sway bar end links. Now this is going to be the same process as the front. We're going to send that stud through our sway bar, attach our nylon lock nut, take our 6mm Allen key and a 19mm wrench, and we can tighten that down. So what we can do now is attach the bottom with our factory bolt. And we can tighten it down with an 18mm socket and wrench. So our next step is to install our shocks. However, we do have to bore out this hole on our lower shock mount. So we need to make sure that it is 5/8 of an inch because we are relocating the shock to the outside of this mount. So I'm going to take a step bit and my drill and my safety glasses and drill this out to 5/8 of an inch. So what we can do now is take our pin where we're relocating our shock, making sure that the thinner side is going through our shock mount. We can take our sleeve, put that inside the shock mount, put our pin through, attach our flat washer and our nylon lock nut. So what we can do now is position our shock up with the factory bar pin location and slide this onto our pin. So after we have our shock mounted up to our pin here, what we can do is put on our flat washer and our nylon lock nut, and we can tighten this side down as well as the other side of our pin. So I'm going to use a 19mm ratcheting wrench and a 6mm Allen socket to hold the pin still. And then after the bottom's secure, what we can do is secure the top. So now we can take the factory bolts and bolt them down into that factory location. Now on this new shock, you are going to have an open part of a bar pin and then a closed part of the bar pin. So after those are both threaded in, what we can do is tighten that down with the 16mm swivel socket, and I'm going to be using that 15-inch extension. Then we can repeat that process on the other side. So our last and final step before we put our Wrangler on the ground and tighten everything up and torque everything down is to install our exhaust spacers. Now, if you have a 3.6 liter V6 like this one, you will have to install these exhaust spacers. They are recommended over 2.5 inches of lift because after that 2.5 inches of lift, the drive shaft comes in contact with the exhaust and can wear down the boot over time, damaging it and damaging the drive shaft. So what we have to do is remove the 2 bolts on either exhaust flange, which is very difficult. So because of the exhaust heating up and cooling down, it makes the bolts on the flanges very brittle and it makes them basically deteriorate. So it is very difficult to get them out. Now, they are very common to break. As you can tell, I've already broken one. I put the ratchet in the socket on one and took one turn and it already broke. So in that case, what I'm going to do is actually take an air hammer and punch out the other side so we can put a nut and a washer on the other side of our exhaust flange instead of threading it into the welded nut that is on our exhaust flange. So what I'm going to try to do is get the rest of the bolts out. I did soak them in PB Blaster. I do recommend that you do that before you even start the lift kit, but we're going to go ahead and see how it goes. So as you can tell, these are very deteriorated. Some that I have seen are in pretty good shape where you can remove this bolt, but there are no threads left on this. So I'm going to use a 16-inch socket and a 3/8 inch drive ratchet and try to wedge that onto the bolt head. All right, so if your bolts are in pretty good condition, what you can probably do is use heat, but as you can tell, ours have snapped. Actually, all 4 of ours have snapped. So I just turned the flange here and I am going to hit this out with an air hammer. These are pressed in, so they're not actually welded nuts on the back of here. These are pressed into the flange, so we should be able to separate that bolt here, or that nut here, from the flange. So one came out, now we need to flip the flange. Now we can punch out the two on the other side. So what I'm gonna do for clearance to separate the exhaust is just loosen up this cross member here. So I have an 18mm swivel socket, my impact wrench, as well as a small extension, and we're just gonna loosen up those bolts. So it also might be helpful to disconnect the muffler from the hangers in the back, just because it's going to give you some more slack. But having somebody pry on the exhaust, you can lift up and kind of fit the spacer in. And once you release that, it should fit back into the flange there. So before we go ahead and move to the other side, what I'm going to do is take our provided bolts and washers, and also a nut and a flat washer that I outsourced to secure this down. And we're gonna go ahead and install that, make sure our other side stays together. So once that's attached, then we can move to the other side and install our longer passenger side exhaust spacer. So before we go ahead and move to the passenger side exhaust spacer, you might want to put the muffler back into its rear hangers, just because it's gonna make it more difficult if you don't. Now what we can do is pull down on the exhaust and put in our longer spacer on the passenger side and kind of reposition it so that spacer is sitting on the flange correctly. So after all the bolts are attached on your flanges, what we can do now is tighten this down with a 13mm socket and a 13mm wrench if you had to put a nut on the back side of the bolt. So this side is a little bit harder to reach, so I'm going to use a 13mm open-ended and box wrench and a 13mm ratcheting wrench. So after we have our exhaust spacers in, what we want to do is reconnect our drive shaft. Now you will need blue Loctite to make sure that those are secured in there correctly. Just going to add a little bit of blue Loctite to each of our drive shaft bolts. So after all your bolts are threaded in, what we can do is take our 15mm socket and our extension that we use to take out those bolts and tighten those down. Last but not least, we can reinstall our cross member. So I'm going to start with this back bolt using an 18mm socket. Then we can move to the side bolts using an 18mm swivel. Now we can throw the tires on and put the Jeep down on the ground. So that's going to wrap it up for my review and install. Make sure you like and subscribe, and for more products and videos like this, always keep it right here at ExtremeTerrain.com.